Hello, everyone, and welcome to Herdacity's monthly webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about communicating in a virtual world, and I'm really glad you chose to join us today. If you are new and or unfamiliar with Herdacity, I'd love to share very briefly about us. Herdacity is a nonprofit based in Austin, Texas, dedicated to inspiring confidence in women to achieve their professional goals. Our goal is to be a resource for you. So please visit our website at herdacity.org to learn more about the resources we have available for you today. So without further ado, I would love to welcome and introduce our speaker today, a award-winning television personality and owner of Barnes Team Media, Kim Barnes.
Hi, Lorelei. It's so good to be here with you today.
Hi, Kim. It's a pleasure. So today you're going to be sharing with us communicating in a virtual world and all of the tips and tricks that goes with it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is the world we're living in. So I can't wait to dive in.
Let's take it there.
All right. Well, when I think about when I was in college back a long time ago at the University of Texas studying broadcast journalism, I knew that I wanted to be a broadcast journalist, a television news reporter. And I knew that part of my job description would include being on camera. And while I wasn't necessarily very good at it a long time ago, I knew that that would be a skill that would be really important for me to get good at. And was part of the decision that was part, when I made my decision about choosing that profession. And I would venture to guess that there probably isn't any of you who thought, if I become an entrepreneur, or I own my own business, or I become an executive in corporate America, or I become a real estate agent, or an insurance agent, or a business coach, or whatever you might be, fill in the blank. I imagine you didn't think, if I pick that profession, perfect, then I'll get to be on camera all the time. Anyone? I doubt it. Yet here we are in this virtual world. And I think that the importance of being able to communicate well in a virtual world is so important, because I think, as we found, it's not going to go away. While we were sort of all thrown into it without any choice back in March, we realized that if we can get really good and effective with our virtual communication, it can save us a lot of time, it can save us a lot of money, and frankly, it's just pretty convenient. So I think it's going to be a skill that is going to be important from here on out. And during this presentation, we're going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to talk about making a meaningful connection, because that is a little bit different when you're on camera versus in person. How to come across as your very best self, what you're saying, even when you're not talking. And of course, we're going to hit on some Zoom do's and don'ts, or whatever virtual platform you're on, but some of those do's and don'ts. When we think about communication in general, if I had asked you back in March, pre-pandemic, when you think of communication, what images come up for you? I would imagine it would include maybe being in an audience, listening to a speaker. It might be being the speaker or the presenter yourself. It could be being in a business meeting, a client meeting, a board meeting, a volunteer meeting, networking, even a job interview, or even doing social interaction. You think of that kind of communication, you think of it all being in person with other people. Yet, today's reality looks a lot different. A lot of our communication, or most of our communication, is me and my computer. And while communication skills are so important all the time, and they're going to be parts of it that translate very well. So if you're a good communicator in person, there are parts that you can translate to being effective when you're virtual as well. However, there are little parts of it and things that are different that you have to take into consideration when you're virtual that you don't even have a thought about when you are in person. So first, I want to start with a poll to kind of get a sense of, how are you feeling about being virtual? What are some of the things that come up for you? And what are your thoughts about it? And I know it might change on any given day, so you can choose multiple choices. You have, because again, you may feel differently today than you did yesterday, or even an hour from now. So I'd love to get your thoughts on, how do you feel about being virtual? Do you love it because it's so convenient? Do you hate it because it feels like something's missing, or it's really awkward? Some days do you just think I'm all zoomed out? I'm still adapting, but that's why you're here today, to learn some new tips and tricks. I've embraced it. What choice do we have? Or I see myself incorporating virtual from here on out. And maybe again, it's a combination of those. And during this presentation, I want it to be very interactive. So I'm going to be asking you questions as we go along. I'd love for you to put answers in the chat later on, so that I can just get a sense of what, how you're feeling about things. I want this to be interactive, and you can go ahead and start putting questions in the Q&A, and we'll talk about those at the very end. But again, I want this to be really interactive, because I think that there are so many different emotions that come around with the virtual communication. And I'm excited to see kind of how you feel about the different answers, and, kind of what your thoughts are about how it works for you. Okay, let's look at this. Love it. It's so convenient. 42% say that they really love it. Only 9% say they hate it. That's good. 22% feel like they're all zoomed out. 42%, I'm still adapting. That's why you're here today. So glad for you to be here today. I've embraced it. What choice do we have? That's 40%. And I see myself incorporating virtual from here on out. That's 47%. Half of you realize the importance of the fact that if we can be good and effective being virtual, wow, there are so many opportunities that we can have going forward. Frankly, how many times have you worn shoes in the last few months? Because you can do so much work from home and from your computer, and nobody ever sees your feet. So again, there's so many things about being virtual that are really, really convenient. And while we can't replace that in-person interaction, we just can't replace that virtually, we can come pretty close to being able to be as effective. So I feel like if, we can go from a situation where we can have a chance to maybe go meet with our clients in person once a quarter instead of once a month, or different things like that, that could really save a lot of time and money. And it also gives us the ability to potentially be and attend other events in other cities, other states that we could never be doing very easily, or not nearly as easily, if we were having to hop on a plane and be in person with somebody. And as I mentioned, I think with, on any given day, you may feel a little bit different depending on your experience, if you had 12 virtual meetings that day, or if you only had 2. But I think that when this all started in March, people were just so thrilled that there was a lot of grace, because we just thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. We can actually technically get together and have communication. And I think that, we've been doing this a long time, but yet we're still seeing a lot of Zoom don'ts. So have you seen that guy or gal, or have you been that guy or gal yourself? And certainly when we are virtual, and especially when we're working from home, we do have so many different considerations that we have to think about, whether it's, kids not kids barking, although I guess my dog is kind of a kid. And, and as much as I tell my dog, hey, you need to be quiet, when the UPS man drives up and she hears that truck because he brings treats, all bets are off, because she's going to bark even if I've asked her to be quiet. We've got kids at home. We have spouses working from home. We just have a house full of people. So there are some things that we sometimes can't get around, but certainly there are things that we can do to help ourselves come across even better and be providing a better experience for the people that we are communicating with. And that's going to be so important. I'd love for you to give me some feedback in the chat. So when you think about going virtual, what are the things that kind of come up for you? Is it the fact that you just get frustrated working the technology? Is it the fact that you just really don't like being on camera? Or the fact that you just really hate that face-to-face interaction that we're missing? Is it hitting the wrong button and making a mistake sometimes when you're doing a presentation? It happens to all of us. Or could it be something else? And I'd love for you to put that in the chat about just kind of what's kind of coming on up for you. Let's see. Yes, somebody said being on camera, having tech difficulties adds to your stress. For sure. Those aren't things that we have to worry about when we're in person, right? Those are just, we just can see the person and we can read their body language a little bit better. We can see their social cues. Being on camera, being single with no pets, no kids, comes in handy. Certainly you don't have those built-in distractions. Although sometimes, the yard person comes out or the trash truck drives by and makes a loud noise as well. So keeping the audience engaged is also a challenge for sure. Hitting the wrong button, too boring, I get distracted. So yes, all of those are challenges with being virtual. So there are things that we have to do a little differently or try to focus on. And those are some of those things that we're going to talk about today. Finding the right link. That's frustrating too. When you're trying to get to the meeting and you can't find it, and where do they send it? Is it in my email? Did I delete it accidentally? So many different things that just kind of are just new things that we've had to learn. So I think that there's just so many different things that come into play. So I have a little exercise I want you to do first, which don't laugh. I know your phone's not too far away from you. And assuming that you're not using your phone to connect to this webinar, I would love for you to grab it real quick and take a selfie, not smiling. And I am kind of setting you up. I understand. I'm aware, but I want to show you two things that I think that can be pretty insightful and hopefully will be helpful for you to see. So let's see, where's my phone? Whoop, there it is. Okay, so everybody take a quick selfie, not smiling. And then what I want you to do is take a look at your picture and see, what does the expression on your face look like? Because oftentimes we're giving off an impression maybe that we're not intending. So do you look sad? And I'd love for you to put that in the chat. Do you look sad? Do you look happy? Do you look engaged? Do you look excited? Do you look bored? Do you look annoyed? Or some other expression, bored. In the chat, who else? Yes, just a resting face that may not be very pleasant, tired, mad, annoyed. And that's super common because for some of us, we have mouths that just naturally turn down. So it can give us just kind of a sad look, even when that's not at all what we mean. We're just listening. But one of the things that we can also keep in mind of too is that when we are nervous or uncomfortable, that different parts of our personality can come up to kind of compensate a little bit. So we can become a laugher or a leaner or a reader or a rambler or a whisperer or a nervous Nelly or an ummer or a liker or something else that just kind of, again, just sort of comes up. So we're silly or we're trying to, make adjustments to the camera or we're having those tech issues. And so if the first thing that somebody sees when we pop into the meeting, and this is true when you're in person as well, but especially when you're virtual, is this, frantic face, what impression are you giving off? And of course, we've all heard you never get a second chance to make a first impression. So the thing I think can be really helpful, because we're not likely going to walk around and smile or sit in a virtual meeting the whole time and smile like this, because one, your cheeks just get tired and they start twitching, and or it just might not be, it doesn't feel natural and it feels a little bit fake. But what we can do is just think about having a little bit of a grin. And it's not a big movement. It's just a couple little muscles that you're activating. And that all of a sudden can make the other person that we're communicating feel more welcome and make them feel more comfortable. And so much of what we're doing with virtual communication is trying to make the other people feel comfortable and help them have a great experience. So just that little grin can be really helpful in helping us come across as being more engaged, because we are paying attention. We just want to make it, want the other person to be able to feel like we are paying attention and that we are engaged as well. Now, the second reason why I wanted you to take the selfie is take a look at it. And I'd love for you to put this in the chat. When you took the photo, were you looking at yourself in the screen, or were you looking up here in the camera? I'd love for you to put that in the chat, because I think that this is something that's very different than when we are in person. So let's see, anybody taking a picture? Were they looking at yourself on the screen? Camera for eye contact, bonus points for you. Myself in the screen, myself at the camera, a couple of you, yes. So here's the thing that is something we just have to get used to, is that when we are virtual, our inclination is that we want to look down at the people that we're talking to, and or even in a selfie we look at ourselves because one, we're used to looking at ourselves in the mirror, but also sometimes if that's the only person we can talk to, we want to feel like we're at least talking to a person, and that feels really normal to us because we would never go up to a person in person and talk to their ear and say, oh my gosh, it's so good to meet you. Can't wait to learn more about your business. Because that would be really awkward, wouldn't it? If somebody came up with and was interacting with you in person and never made eye contact, might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. You might walk away from the conversation and think, it's kind of a strange conversation. I'm not really sure why. And you might not be able to articulate that it was because that person never looked at you in the eye. But the thing that's different about being on camera is that if I am looking down at myself or looking at the people I'm talking to, then I'm not making eye contact with them. If I want them to feel like I'm talking right to them, I have to look right up at the lens. And it feels so unnatural because it's just not what we're used to doing. But we also know that we don't have to necessarily stare at the camera because we wouldn't stare at somebody in person either. Somebody looks away occasionally, but it's just not wanting to be kind of shifty-eyed, where you're sort of looking around. There's sometimes we have a conversation with a person and you feel like they're always looking around to see who else might be, if there's somebody better to talk to, and that can make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. The same kind of concept kind of is true when you just try to figure out what are they looking at. So it can be a little bit shifty. And so it also is a little bit of a dance because certainly when the other person is talking, you want to look down at them because you want to see how they're responding, how they're reacting. We just need to remember that if we want them to feel like we're making that eye contact, that we need to make sure that we're looking right at the lens, because eye contact is how we make a connection. And in business, we always, we hear so many times that, people like to work and buy from people that they know, like, and trust. And what is one of the most effective ways for us to build that trust? It's making that eye contact and starting to build that relationship. And so that's why it's so, so important. Something else that you don't necessarily think about when you're in person as much as you might do with being virtual is that you need to be aware of the situation. The fact that you're just in this little box. So like this friend of mine here showed up with a sleeveless shirt on and didn't realize that her long hair made it look like she doesn't have a shirt on. So you have to be aware of how am I showing up in my box, if you will, so that you make sure that, we can see a little bit more context. We don't need to just see just your chin and up, but just think about, be aware of what we're showing, and also certainly being appropriate for the situation. I think one of the kind of Zoom habits that a lot of people have gotten into is, while we can be more casual when we're at home, think about, is that the same way I would show up if I was appearing for a networking event or a board meeting or, those kinds of things, a meeting with my boss? Is that the same way that I might show up? So just want to be appropriate for the situation. I know everybody is working from home. And so there is, there are different expectations sometimes, but just being aware of what's appropriate in the, in that situation. And the biggest thing too, is that especially when it comes to our appearance, is we just don't want to be distracting. So if we have loud bracelets or earrings that are banging against our earphones, or, outfits that we're fidgeting with, that can just be distracting to somebody else that we're talking to, and maybe even to yourself. And one little tip is that if you wear a color that you look good in, that just builds your confidence in and of itself. So bright colors typically look really, really good, but just again, knowing the colors that look good on you are going to be really, really helpful. And yes, somebody mentioned, I tell people all the time, if you need a help looking at the lens, put a little sticky note or a smiley face to remind you, hey, if I want to make eye contact, let me look up at the people I'm talking to. This is super common, and it's easy to do this way, and also pretty easy to fix, although it does take a couple steps. But a lot of times what happens is that we just set our laptop down on our desk or on the table or on our lap, and then we just push the laptop back. And so we get this sort of up the nose shot. And it's just not really necessarily a flattering look for anybody. And more importantly, it keeps us from being on the same plane with the people that we're talking to. So if you think about movie directors, they often shoot down or shoot up because they're trying to make somebody look inferior or superior. And same is true if you were to show up at a board meeting, you wouldn't have one person in the desk chair and then somebody else in a kiddie chair, because it just wouldn't feel, it wouldn't feel the same. So if you think about the fact of having your camera eye level, just helps you be on the same plane, and it will also correct for some of the lighting issues that happen. You don't end up having the ceiling fan over your head, whipping around over your head, or bright lights over your head either. If you raise it up, that'll help alleviate that as well. But just, a couple of books, a box, you can get a laptop stand, but you don't have to do anything fancy. It can be just as simple as a box and some books, but that will just keep you on the same plane. And it can be a little bit above, a little bit below, a little bit above. That's fine. It's mainly just wanting to be mostly at eye level. And then another thing that is so important in helping us make that connection and be able to make that eye contact, they have to be able to see our eyes. And so what happens often, if we have a bright window behind us, this is what happens. And we can't see her eyes. So it's hard to build that relationship when we can't make that connection. And so the easiest thing in this situation, when it's possible, is just flip yourself around, have that window in front of you so that you have more light in front of you than behind you. Because a lot of times people might think, oh, I have this pretty backyard, or I just planted some flowers, I'll sit in front of the window, and think that you'll be able to see that, but you can't. The camera is just iris down, which take in all that bright light, and it makes your face dark. So you want to think about having more light in front of you than behind you. And also think about not having a background that's super distracting. And, and I know working from home, this can be a little bit of a challenge. Sometimes it's finding just a little bit of a nook. We had a client that we worked with who had actually put this little kind of mini set, if you will, but not really a set, but a little space in her garage where she put a table and a light, and it looks fantastic. And you would never know that she's in her garage. So that's a little bit of an extreme case, but certainly there are things, little corners that you can find, or just thinking of, okay, what can I find that will work in the best situation? And there are virtual backgrounds as well. And those can get a little bit buggy. Sometimes it's better than the alternative, but if you can find just a non-distracting background, you don't have something coming out of your head or things like that, a good background, again, because we all know that we're working from home, so people have some grace about that as well. Another thing that's so important when we're virtual, which again, we don't really have to worry about as much in person, is making sure that the person we're talking to can hear us, because we can't squint to listen. And so if the audio is really bad, you can't really hear them, then it's hard to continue the conversation. And I'm going to show you, or let you hear, the difference. Off the external microphone that I have, and now I'm just using the microphone that's built into my computer. Can you hear the difference? There's a big difference. And again, it's not terrible. You can still hear me, but if the trash truck was to go by outside, if it was going to start thundering, if my dog started barking, the internal microphones are just designed to suck in all of that sound. If it's from across the room, it just brings in all of that sound. So whenever you can have a virtual, have an external microphone, it will just be ideal. Even if it's just earphones, AirPods, anything that can give you just that external microphone. And, again, as simple as just using these earphones can make a difference. And especially if you have a lot of people in your home all having to do the same thing at the same time, it can also help you just stay focused on the conversation, which is also going to help you from getting distracted and being able to stay more part of that conversation than if you are listening, or if you're somebody like me who gets distracted by, things that are going on, then you'll be able to stay focused on that conversation. And once you have kind of you've got yourself set up so that you're going to look and sound good, it's also important to keep in mind that, again, good communication skills are good communication skills, although a little bit different when you are virtual. But some of these are going to be important and helpful no matter what kind of platform, whether in person or virtual. But the biggest thing is that, being as conversational as you can, because you want to be thinking of, how do I communicate this? A lot of times people think, oh gosh, I'm going to write out something and I'm going to try to memorize it. Well, for one, memorizing is really hard. Unless you've had a lot of theater experience, memorizing is really hard. And it also can come across as the fact that you're sort of reading it in your mind. If you look at inexperienced news reporters, a lot of times you can, and you watch them doing a live shot, especially, you can almost feel like you can look past their eyes, that they get this kind of glazed look in their eyes, because it's as if they're reading their eyelids, because they're trying to have memorized the little script that they wrote for themselves to use for their live shot. So, watch for that, and maybe you'll get that idea, but it's basically, they're sort of reading their eyelids. And so you want to come across as conversational. That doesn't mean slang or too laid back, but it just means having a conversation and being able to have that ebb and flow in a conversation, and those pauses and things like that that are part of good communication, that sometimes get taken away if you feel like you're just reading, whether you literally are reading or the fact that you are reading your mind, if you will. Another thing that I think is really helpful to remember is that you are the expert about what you're talking about, and nobody knows you're nervous unless you tell them. And they also don't have any idea what you were planning to say. So even today, as I'm speaking to you, I may have some things that I had planned to say or still plan to say, and maybe it comes out exactly the way I had kind of imagined it in my head, and maybe it doesn't. But as long as I'm getting the gist across to you, then you're still going to feel like you got the information that you need. And obviously, if you leave out something really important, have notes if you need to. That's fine, so that you don't forget those important points. But don't feel like you have to be stuck to a script or stuck to or say things in the exact way. Now, occasionally you have something that needs to be really precise. If you're quoting a quote, obviously you want to try to get that word for word. So again, it might be that you need to look down and read that because you want to make sure you get it right. But just remember that you are the expert, and more often than not, the reason why they're tuning in or listening, or you're presenting at this board meeting, or that this client is listening to you present, is because you're the expert and they want to hear what you have to say. Something that is such a important part of good communication skills as well is just crutch words. And if anybody would love to put that in the chat, some of the crutch words that you hear often, what are the ones that kind of stick out to you, that you kind of tend to notice? Like, so let's see, who else? And, but there's so many different ones, that's great. Again, it can be so many different things. And frankly, sometimes it might be something different every time. It may be ending every sentence when you are sharing or teaching, right? Just to make sure that they're following along. So, yes, so many different ones. And crutch words in and of themselves are not that big of a deal because we all say them on occasion. It's just when we have so many of them that they tend to become a distraction. I had a neighbor tell me that they actually had a boss that they would count, because he said, in so many presentations over and over and over again, that we know that if you're just listening for the what are you listening to? And you probably didn't hear any of the other words that were said. So it can become just a huge distraction. Do you understand what I'm saying? Again, it can be anything that just becomes repetitive enough that you tend to notice that instead of what we're actually talking about. And keep in mind that a crutch word is nothing more than just a split second that our brain is using to catch up. And whether it's your mouth or your brain gets ahead of each other, I know that happens to me. That's all that's for. And so if we have, and the more we have a plan and we have thought out what we're going to talk about too, that can alleviate some of those crutch words. But the biggest thing is just to be aware of when are the times that I tend to do that, and being aware even in our regular conversation. The more that a world without crutch words becomes just the way you communicate, that will be the way you communicate even when you're in a nerve-wracking situation, especially if you don't necessarily love being put on the spot, or you feel like, if you're an introvert, that when you are talking in a virtual meeting that you feel like all eyes are on you in a different way than they might be even in a meeting at work. So it's just important to know that, okay, let me think about, how can I do this in my everyday conversation? How can I think about and be aware when I start feeling one coming? Because obviously, if you're not aware, you can't make a change of any habit that you have. So being aware and trying just to pause for a second. Now, if you're in the middle of a sentence, you might not want to pause there because that might make that sort of might call attention to it, or somebody just, be a little bit jarring. But I think that you want to be mindful that it's okay to pause. So hear it coming, try to pause, get your thought together, and keep going. And what happens is that most of the time, that pause that we take, which sounds like a really long time in our own head, because especially when we're presenting or speaking, or we have the floor, when we stop talking, there's silence, and it can feel really, really awkward. But most of the time, it just sounds like you took a breath when you are making that short pause. Now, again, if it's too long, it might be awkward, and or somebody else might jump into the conversation because they think you're done. So you have to be, a little bit careful about how long that pause is, but it just comes with practice. Again, with your spouse, your kids, your coworkers, anybody that you communicate with, start just doing it as your everyday conversation and see if it doesn't make a difference. And that way, when you are under stress, that's not one more thing that you're even trying to think about, because that's just the way you talk. That's the way you communicate. And so that doesn't even have to be a factor, because your brain just can't think of too many things at the same time. And then also, we talk about what we're saying and the words that are coming out, but also let's be thinking about what are the things that people are hearing from us, even when we're not saying a word. And a lot of that is our body language. So are we leaning back? And what's strange about being on camera or being virtual is that it's really a two-dimensional world. So you can see the difference that when I'm leaning back, it just kind of can somehow just make me look not as interested or engaged versus sitting up straight. And I know it's hard when you have meetings back to back to back to back. So, do you need to put a pillow behind you? What can you do that helps you feel more comfortable, but doesn't necessarily, have you just leaning too much to the side, doesn't have you swiveling in your chair, doesn't have you with arms crossed, the same kinds of things that you think about when you're in person, having good posture, all of those things are going to be true when you're virtual as well. And these are things that I think can easily be, bad habits that we slip into, again, because we are having to take some Zoom meetings sitting on our bed, because that's the only place we have at the moment that we can do a meeting from. Maybe there's this one chair that we have to sit in. So, we know that you may be trying to move around and find different environments, because it gets boring and tiring sitting in the exact same place all the time. But, just being aware of what are the things that we can get a little bit lax on when we're virtual that we would do differently if we were in person. And so just be mindful of that. As we talked about earlier, the facial expressions are super important, because people are, even when we're in our boxes, and again, this doesn't mean that you have to smile the whole time, because that is uncomfortable and your cheeks would start hurting. But it's just kind of thinking about just having that pleasant look on your face, because they often are going to read an impression from you, whether you intend it or not. And, it's not necessarily fair all the time, but that's just what happens. And so you don't want to necessarily have somebody think, oh gosh, she doesn't like my idea. And it really isn't that at all. You're just literally thinking about something else, or what you have to do coming up later. So, just be aware of your facial expressions, because that can be a distraction. And your tone of voice, just as, again, good communication skills. Am I somebody who tends to use a lot of upspeak, meaning that, I think I could do really good on this project, which makes it sound more like a question when I'm ending my sentence on kind of an up note all the time. Is it that I tend to have kind of a really soft, quiet voice, and so I'm getting stepped over, especially on a virtual meeting where it's harder sometimes to read those social cues and that body language. Just being aware of how does my tone of voice come across, so that you are doing the things that you and coming across in the way that you really intend. So just being aware of that, and even just the bad habits that we might come into too, that we need to be aware of, that whether it's, oh gosh, I didn't realize that I put my hair behind my ears every 5 seconds, or whenever I'm nervous, I make this face, or, just being aware of those things will allow you to hopefully help kind of break that habit. And so much of our communication in general is how do we harness our emotions, especially if this is something that is still a little nerve-wracking for you. And what I like to share is that when we think about how we feel when we're nervous, our palms sweat, our hearts race, we might have butterflies in our stomach. Well, interestingly, the exact same physiological feelings we have often when we are excited. Our palms sweat, our heart races, we get butterflies in our stomach. So what if we can just try to make sure that we're harnessing the excitement part of that, if you will, instead of the nervousness that we might be feeling. And that hopefully will help us in all of our communications skills and in situations where we are, whether we are in person, when we do get back to that, and as we continue this very important and virtual communication that I know is going to be here to stay. So hopefully this gave you a lot of great actionable tips that you can put into practice right this very minute. And I would love to open it up for Q&A now.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Kim. That was incredible. So as Kim mentioned, we're going to open it up for Q&A. The Q&A button is at the bottom as well as chat. Go ahead and start sending in your questions for Kim. So Kim, we did have a few earlier questions that I want to ask you now.
Sure.
First question was, you had mentioned a few of the do's and don'ts, and busy backgrounds was one of them. So one of our attendees mentioned that she sits on the couch for her meetings. She has good posture and the background is very plain. Is sitting on the couch a no-no?
I mean, again, I don't think any place, because we're having to work from home, is a definite no-no. You have to know kind of what your situation is, who's your audience, what's appropriate for the situation. I do think that those busy backgrounds can sometimes be distracting. So, especially if you don't want dirty laundry in the background or, kids running around or whatever. So I think that I don't know that whether you sit on a chair or on your bed. I've seen some people having to do virtual meetings from their bed and they just sit right up against their headboard and it looks kind of like just a background. So I think it just depends on that situation. So I wouldn't say that there's necessarily any chair that you shouldn't sit in, but I would think that it might be helpful just to keep in mind, is it something that I just can't help but sit back like this the whole time? Because again, see, with it being two-dimensional, it just looks different than if I'm sitting like this. So I think it's just, can you put some pillows behind you and maybe that helps you still sit up straight, or it sounds like she has good posture already. So just being mindful of, I don't know that there's not a hard and fast rule, I would say, unless it's sort of a lounge chair and I'm in the lazy boy with it kicked back all the way, and again, for a social meeting, that might be fine. If it's your family virtual meeting of the week, that might be fine. But just, if you're talking to a new potential client or your CEO, maybe that's not the way you want to come across.
Got it. Thank you. So next question. How do we stay focused on looking at the lens during long intervals?
One, I think it depends on if you're having to do all the talking. Again, when we have conversations, I, may look down at my notes on occasion. I may think for a second. So I don't think you have to be necessarily glued to the camera the whole time, especially if you're not talking. Zoom did just introduce a new feature that you can actually move. If you're in a meeting, you can move a box up and around. So one thing you could do is that if you wanted to feel like I'm not looking down at that person who's talking the whole time, so I feel like I'm actually, looking down the whole time, you could even just pull their box up to the top. And again, you're still not going to be making eye contact, but if you're trying to watch them, it would at least be closer. Because again, when they're talking, it's totally fine if you want to look at them. It's just when you're talking and you want to make eye contact, that's when it's so important to look at the lens.
Okay, what about when we're in Zoom meetings or whatever the virtual meeting is of the day, right? And we want to maybe turn our cameras off.
And that's such a common question. And I think it depends on, a variety of factors. We did a training yesterday and a lot of the people had their cameras off. One was driving and so they were just listening. So that seemed, appropriate. I do think that when we can leave our cameras on, at least as the person who is leading the meeting, it makes them feel better because it makes them feel like you're paying attention better, whether you really are or not, because sometimes people may just have their camera on and they really are glued to the information. So I think probably it depends on what's appropriate for that situation. Is it a classroom where the teacher has said, please have your cameras on, or your CEO is doing an important team meeting and it's important for you to have your camera on. So maybe it's kind of knowing when is it important, when does it not really matter? And, sometimes I think too, it's kind of as a courtesy, nice to say, hey, I'm eating, so I'm turning my mic off. I'm turning my camera off, but I'm listening. because, maybe we don't want to, watch you chowing down for everybody to be seeing, or you don't feel comfortable doing that. So at least it helps them understand why you have your camera off.
Right. Okay. Excellent. So a lot of our attendees are women, and we got lots of hair. What about with the hairstyle, the hair up, hair down, hair back? What's the situation there? What's your best practices?
I think whatever is going to be least distracting for you is one thing to consider. If you are wearing your hair in a way that you're going to be, doing this the whole time because it's going to bother you, or your bangs are doing something funny, or or if you're somebody who flips your hair a lot, okay, well, maybe it's better if you pull it back. And this is similar to if you were in person. I have a friend who's a professional speaker, and she had her speech coach tell her she needed to put her hair up, put a clip, because she kept fussing with her hair the whole time while she was talking. So, I don't think that there's a hard and fast rule. Whatever makes you feel most comfortable and will be less distracting for you, I think will also help be less distracting to the people who are watching too.
Okay. Next question. Talk to us about lighting. A lot of us are finding some, quick lighting solutions. We don't always have the sun out every day. What can we do about lighting besides like collecting all the lamps in our house and putting them in front of us?
Well, I mean, I think that can be a pretty simple solution. There are some simple solutions. Yes, a window is always ideal. Today's kind of cloudy, so I have 2 windows in front of me, and normally that's all I need. But I had to turn on some extra lights today just because it's not as bright as it normally is. Lighting can be it's a lot of trial and error because you just have to figure out what works well. But literally, sometimes just getting a lamp that you can put in front of you or behind the computer might be all you need. There are ring lights, and there's all kinds of different options that you can try. And again, some of it's going to depend on how close you are to the camera, what other lights you have. One thing that is definitely true is just turning on all the lights in your room or in the house doesn't necessarily help, because if you end up turning on just a bunch of bright lights that are behind you, that's not going to actually do anything but make your face darker, likely, because it's going to see all the bright lights behind you. So sometimes literally just getting a lamp and putting it in front of you can help. And we have some resources on our website just for ideas, but again, try to find some things that you might already have. One little tip about the light bulb, though, is be mindful of what type of light bulb it is. If you have a daylight bulb, it gives a whiter, just clear daylight cast, where sometimes that soft white bulb can give a little bit of a yellow cast. So you don't necessarily want a mixture too in the same room. But again, depending on your skin tone, most of us are going to look better if we have not a yellowish cast on us.
Okay, excellent advice.
But it is trial and error for sure. And there is a new feature actually in Zoom as well that adds a little bit of extra brightness. So because our cameras are designed to try to bring in as much light as possible, and will kind of iris. If you're in a dark area, it will iris up, which will make you a little bit brighter, but can also make you look grainy. So if you've noticed that, sometimes it makes it look like the video quality is not that good. And it's really just because it's trying to account and give you extra light. So the trade-off is that, yes, we can see your face a little bit better, but you also might be a little bit grainy at the same time.
Got it. All right. How do you feel about virtual backgrounds?
I think it depends. I think that for some people, they're better than the alternative. Okay. Depending on where you are. I do think that they are buggy, or can be. And so you just have to be aware of that some of it's going to depend on the type of computer you have, the processor speed. So some computers can't do a virtual background unless you have a true green screen. So that's just something to consider. And some just aren't going to be, we've all seen that where, your head kind of gets sort of cut off, or you look kind of helmet head, or hands disappear if you use your hands a lot. So you just have to be kind of mindful of that. If you do have a green screen, it does look a whole lot better, because it's just, basically you have to remember that we're trying to make our computers do what, if you've ever been in a news studio and seen the weather done with a green screen or chroma key or any movie effects as well, they have super great lighting, and they are able to chroma key, is what it's called, the image over that green screen. And so they have all the technology, and here we're trying to ask our personal computer to do the same thing, and it just, obviously isn't going to be able to do as good a job as it does in a studio. So I think it takes a little bit of trial and error. It can be a great way to brand yourself, to have your business on your virtual background. But I do think you need a little to play around with it a little bit to find one that works best for you. And certainly if you really feel like, okay, I love this idea, you can get a green screen. And there's even a green screen sort of pop-up thing that can be just on your chair, that looks kind of like those sunshades that roll up, that actually you can get that sit on your chair. So again, I think it just depends on, I always love just a nice background, if when possible, but certainly if you don't have a good alternative, sometimes a virtual background can certainly work in a pinch, or just because of the surroundings that you have to choose from.
Okay, and final question, and I feel like this is a really important one as a communications expert for you to share with our attendees. For those of us who are doing a lot of virtual meetings, because we are virtual and we're not in person, it's difficult to find places to jump into a conversation. So how do we stay professional in our appearance and our signaling when we're trying to interject into a virtual meeting space where there's all these different faces on, your windows? How do you show up and not start speaking over someone?
And that's really tough, because a lot of times there's just a lag. And so even though you feel like there's a silent pause, you jump in, but so did somebody else, because there's just this lag. And I think that one thing that is tricky, I saw this in a meeting just yesterday, that when people have their cameras off, and so we don't see them. So, a lot of times when we're in person, we can kind of feel, that person's about to finish. And so I can jump in, you've got that kind of ebb and flow, if you will. And so sometimes, a person just hops on in that's virtual without their camera on, and we don't even see them. So I think that some of that could be, if you're leading a meeting, that could be part of the way you set it up. So maybe you set up a structure for, okay, we want to make this really interactive. And so what I'm going to ask you is that when you have something to add, whether it's the digital raise your hand or literally just put your hand up so that we can see who's next. So I think that some of that is in the expectation that you could potentially set as the leader. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're not the leader and you don't have that, it could be something that you suggest to your boss. I think the other thing is to kind of, look for those opportunities. And it's tricky, because sometimes you are going to step on somebody, and then you just, unmute yourself or mute yourself again and start back in, and maybe just watch as somebody just unmuted themselves so that you can tell they're about to talk. So it's just kind of being aware what's going on in the room, but also then, and I have done this in meetings before where I've kind of just raised my hand so that way they potentially can see me and know that I have something to add. But it is trickier, because you can't read those social cues and that body language as well virtually as you can in person. But I do think sometimes it's in how do you set up the expectation of the interaction so that it feels more comfortable and you don't have to feel like you might be interrupting somebody, and just knowing that you might, and just apologize, or, maybe you don't need to apologize, but just acknowledge and say, oh, let me let you go first, and then know that you can step in. And that way they then at least know that you have something to add after they're done.
Right. And I do appreciate setting ground rules in the beginning of a meeting. I think that's very helpful. Mm-hmm. So Kim, this has been incredible. I really appreciated your time. Everyone who's watching, if you enjoyed Kim as much as I do, please connect with her. She's going to throw her information up on screen. She's on LinkedIn, on Facebook. She has an amazing website. Do get in touch with her. She has excellent resources for you. And again, if you haven't reached out to Herdacity, this is your first time on a Herdacity webinar, I highly recommend you visit herdacity.org to learn more about the resources we have available for you today. Kim, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Loved being with you.